how do you merge being a Christian with figuring out your purpose?
I think a lot of us, myself included for a long time, Joshua, treated calling like it was something to be found. When in fact, vocation is formed, right? Like it is formed over time. It's much more like there's a piece of big granite rock that God is like chiseling away at with us over time. And the clarity comes out of longevity.
How do you still find significance when you may feel so small in comparison to like seeing LeBron James dunk or, seeing Jay-Z be a billionaire?
I'm not called to be Jay-Z. Does it make my impact on, let's say, 30 people that I'm close with any less significant?
All right, so welcome to the Getting to the Truth podcast, where in a world full of noise, it's so important that we all have truth that we can stand on. This week may be one of the most exciting weeks for me on this podcast, being that when we started this podcast, everybody was always asking, you have to do an episode on purpose. You have to do an episode on like figuring out what your calling is. And in doing that, I wanted to approach the conversation from a perspective of someone who has wisdom from life experiences and research, and also someone who has a biblical perspective. Finding that person was definitely not the easiest thing to do, but we actually did locate this person, the lovely, wise Dr. O'Donnell. And okay, so we're going to get straight into the conversation. So you've written this book, Make Work Matter. And for me, I read the whole thing. Well, listen to it. The audiobook was great. You actually did the speaking on the audiobook.
I was like, oh, you heard me. I sure am.
Yeah. And the way you dissected getting into purpose was amazing. And I think that that I have so many questions about it that I think a lot of people will benefit from. And I think maybe the first question, just to level set, could just be, if somebody were to come to you and ask, what is purpose, or what is calling? Like, do I have a calling? What would you say?
Well, first of all, okay, we're going to start with the big question. I love it.
Yeah.
Second of all, thanks for having me. It's like good to be with you and love the work you're doing, Joshua. So it's a real honor to be here.
Thank you.
Okay. So if someone comes to me and is like, do I have a calling? Simple answer, yes. Right. More complex answer, like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
And like, how do I know how to get after that? How do I know where it's coming from? How do I know what it's not? And so I'm a practical theologian, which means I study theology for the sake of making it practical in people's everyday lives. And when I use the word calling, or the Latin counterpart vocation, you know what I get a lot of times? I get like eye rolls. People are like, oh. And over time, I've learned that we've got actually a fair amount of baggage when it comes to that word. Partly because it's hard to know what it means. Partly because it sounds really attractive. And if we don't have it figured out, like, what's wrong with us? Like, why don't we know what our calling is? Partly because it's hard to hear the voice of God. And like, what does that even mean? And how do we learn to listen to God? And how do we learn to discern? So it's complicated. So yes, but it's super complicated. It's been helpful for me to think about calling actually with an image. And the image is an image of a set of nesting dolls. And why? Let me get into a little bit about like why the nesting dolls. So historically, this would be like the most theological work that's been done on vocation comes out of Eurocentric models in the Protestant Reformation. This is like Martin Luther. So if you know nothing else about the Protestant Reformation, a lot of people have heard about Martin Luther. And what Martin Luther was doing is he was actually saying, hey, folks, the way we think about calling is too limited. At that time, the only way you could have a calling was to have a sort of spiritually significant thing from God, and you became a religious professional, a priest, usually a priest, but there are a couple other options. And Martin Luther was like, hey, that's like everybody can have a spiritual calling from God, whether you're a baker or a candlestick maker or a blacksmith or whatever you're doing. That was like absolutely liberating at that time for the people in Europe, right? This is certainly contextual.
Yeah.
But over time, what happened, and I'll get back to the nesting dolls, over time, what happened is that the way we work changed. Like people started moving around into cities and towns. And today, I mean, we're here like with microphones and video cameras, we're in like the information age. So what does it mean, like, to have a station in the information age? That's it gets a little more complicated. And so the question of calling again got really complicated. So it's been helpful for me to think about it like an image at the core. And I won't do all of them right now, but at the core, the little most concrete, hard to even parse apart one is actually a calling of belonging,
Yeah.
like a belonging to God before any of the doing. And you get different things that are nested without. And finally, once all the deep stuff is nested within, then you can talk about the call to particulars, right? Like maybe I feel a particular calling as a leader, I actually do, as a creative, I actually do, as an author, I actually do. And those are going to play out regardless of what job I have, right? And they are an expression of all that's nested within, traced back to the fact that our very first and most important calling is one of belonging to
Man, and I love that you start with that first like inner core nesting doll of belonging to God. And I think from reading the book, it if there was one thing that I took away, I think it might have even just been that, being that I think when we try to figure out our purpose and we try to figure out our calling, I think for my, and I can speak for myself, like, when you see Dave Chappelle tell a joke, or you see LeBron James like play basketball, it just makes you question, okay, like what can I do? And like, how do I measure my life significance?
God.
And what I love about what you wrote is that you spoke about how you're significant from day one. And like when you're born, you belong to God,
Yep.
and belonging to God in itself, he made you as a significant being. And this is, I'm just repeating what I've learned from your book. You talked about how we are, as significant beings, have the opportunity to then bless the world with whatever we decide to bless the world with. And we're gonna get into it. So I love that. I love that. I love that. So then I'm sure like people ask you, out of all people, all the time. So like, all right. So then how do I figure out my purpose? So of course we have the belonging aspect to it, and then the next thing, doll, would then be your, I guess, vocational work, like what you do for a living, and figuring that out is difficult. How does somebody figure out that vocation that they should take on?
That's such a good question. A couple of things here, and I love it. I'm like you're hired. You're gonna teach this stuff. Like I love the way you're going after it. A couple of things here. One, I think a lot of us, myself included, for a long time, Joshua, treated calling like it was something to be found, right? Like we're gonna find it. I actually have an image one time of being on the beach in Florida and seeing this man. He had headphones on and a metal detector, and he was going through the sand, like waiting for it to beep and waiting to find some treasure. And I'm like, oh, most of us treat vocation or calling like that, like it's something to be found, when in fact vocation is formed, right? Like it is formed over time. It's much more like there's a piece of big granite rock that God is like chiseling away at with us over time. And the clarity comes out of longevity. Like
Mm.
clarity is born from long refinement. And so like the discernment is actually a long process. And that right there is where it starts to get uncomfortable. Because it's like, well, wait a minute, but I got to find it out. And we've said that our job is supposed to be lined up with vocation. So it's like, wait a minute, I'm 22, I'm 23. I've got to know what it is because it's time to go to a job, and I'm supposed to have a job I'm passionate about and a job that's my calling. And like, we're just getting going usually in life. And we don't even know all that we're passionate about. We've just begun to learn. And that's okay. Like, we need that space. So the first thing I say to people is like, we got to make some space for exploration. Some of that exploration might happen in your job, but it's going to happen other places too. And then we need to let that process play out. And we need to be people who can know how to take up that work over the long haul rather than try to have like real quick answers in the short term.
So I love that, and I think you touched in your book. You touched on approaching your career more in like a entrepreneurial way versus, let's say, a linear approach that may have been taken by the generation before us, where I think you compared it to an elevator, where you maybe pick a certain company to work for the rest of your life, and you just climb the corporate ladder, and you almost even can look at that company to take responsibility for your growth as within your career. And you touched on how we should switch that around and take on an entrepreneurial perspective to our calling.
Yeah, I love, again, like, you're hired. You're like, I love the way you're teaching this stuff. The first thing is like just the admission that those systems that worked really well only worked for some people, and now they're pretty much working for nobody. So like the field of this, like, I get in and I predictably get to go up and get off and at retirement with a gold watch, like that was really true for some people, but not for everybody. And now that is not true for anybody. And so the analogy that is more true, and this is not like Michaela's life hacks of how to be, this is just my read the landscape, is that it's much more like we're in, whitewater going down a, rapids, than it is that we're climbing up an elevator, an escalator, or whatever it might be. And that requires a whole different set of skills, right? You need a whole different set of skills in the water. And so I'm also really biased because, like, I'm an entrepreneur. Like, I love starting things. My parents are entrepreneurs, like Irish Catholic folks in the Midwest. It's like what we do. We start businesses. My husband and I started a business. I studied entrepreneurs in my dissertation. I realized at some point, Joshua, that not everybody likes entrepreneurs as much as I do. People are like,
Yeah.
I'm not an entrepreneur. Like, I don't want to do that. It sounds like a lot of work. It sounds like a lot of this. And I'm like, oh, let's like strip it all the way down then. So what it means to be an entrepreneur or entrepreneurial is to be able to like notice needs, right? Take the resources at our disposal and like apply them to those needs in valuable ways. And that right there, I mean, we see that pattern in scripture. We see that pattern in people who, are not starting businesses. And so it's that posture that I'm like, ooh, and that also helps navigate the fact that we're on the rapids and we're not like predictably going up. So yeah, I'm on a one-woman mission to help people be more entrepreneurial.
No, and I love it. And you touched on a couple of things in the book about how, like, even just the term entrepreneurial or creative or things like that sometimes make people feel as if they're not qualified for that. But really, if you think about what you're saying, you're really just saying, hey, like, take ownership of your growth while still kind of having a certain level of like flexibility, being that you can't control everything. And I love that so much. I love it so much. And so that you also talked about passion, right? And you were saying how like everybody wants a job that like aligns with their passions, and you hear it all the time. I mean, I've said it 1,000 times where it's like, hey, I got to make sure that the work I do is work that I'm passionate about. But your perspective was interesting because you actually kind of said like, hey, hold on, is that something that like everybody should be doing? So like, could you,
Yeah. So one of the dysfunctional beliefs that I name in the book is that passion is like the holy grail of work. Now, I actually think passion is important. And I might in this moment be in a job that I've been the most passionate about in my like 15, 20 years of working. So I'm not like, throwing passion out the window. But I think the problem comes in when we use it as a prerequisite for work. Because again, it's like, how do we know what we're passionate about? That's actually a really difficult question. And one, again, that is formed, not found. So if we're like, okay, I gotta get a job that I'm passionate about, that's built on the, understanding that I know what I'm passionate about. And we're not giving the time for that to play out. And so right at the time that we send people into the world, it's like, you're 22, 23, go ahead and figure it out. That there ends up being more heartache there. The amount of people, Joshua, that I talk to who are in their late 20s, early 30s, and they're like, I just, it didn't work. It's not working. It's not working. I'm like, we got to undo that script a little bit. It doesn't mean that passion isn't valuable. It doesn't mean that it's not God-given, because I think it is, but it's not usually automatic. It's something we've got to discover along the way.
Yeah, and it's funny though because it's like in discovering it, we are kind of still forced to make certain choices. Like at 18, or I don't when we first get into college, what's your major? Or like so it's like, it's interesting. And I love your book because what it did is it actually makes you ask certain questions that help figure it out like along the way. And one of the questions I think that you asked was, man, I'm trying to remember. It was basically like something along the lines of like, what what is stressing you, or like what is where like your
Yep.
what was the question again?
Like, where are the pain points?
Where are the pain
Yeah.
points? And then like after you identify those pain points is then, and why do you feel like they're bringing that pain? And like, so like you really, I think what you were touching on is really like being self-aware throughout the process, so that like you can kind of ask continually, like feel out, okay, do I like this? Learn yourself over time. And I think that in doing that, you figure yourself out. As a Christian though, right? So like as a Christian in trying to figure this out, there's been so many things that's been thrown out. So like there's the verse in Jeremiah that you actually, I think, brought a lot of perspective that I didn't even know about. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, well, I'm with you. The self-reflection piece is huge.
Yeah.
And I'll just add the caveat that self-reflection in conversation and in community with people who know you, right? Because we usually have blinders on, and like the process of discovering what we're good at, what we're gifted at, what feels worth putting our time to. First of all, not everybody gets to ask those questions, but for those of us who are asking those questions, I don't have all the answers. It's like my husband is like, oh, like I sort of see you get triggered when this happens. I'm like, you're right. I don't like that kind of thing, and I need to do whatever I can. I might not be able to build around it. I might not. It's still part of my job, but I need to know that, right? To other people.
Yeah.
But yeah, Jeremiah 29:11, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to give you hope in the future, not to harm you. Um, that I remember very significantly for me being on, it was like a mug that I got when I was in like graduation. And I was like, this is awesome. Like, God's got me. God has for sure got me. And it wasn't until I got to seminary and I had a professor take us through Jeremiah 29 that I realized, oh, that passage has nothing to do with my personal career. First of all, God's not like speaking to people about careers in that way in the Bible. Secondly, that like hope comes in the middle of like a really tough period in the history of Israel. They are in exile. So it is a message in the middle of pain that God says, like, I'm not going to leave you. Like, don't worry, I've got you. And God's not speaking to me or to you. He's speaking to Israel. He's speaking to a whole people. And so to narrow that in on just us in the context of our work and vocation is like grabbing it from a place that's not really a fair alignment. Um, and again, like, because it's not a fair alignment, it just ends up setting people up for a lot of disappointment, because it's like, well, what if my life doesn't play out that way? Or what if my passion has nothing to do with my paid work? And what if my purpose here feels, like it goes across things? Like, it's just, it ends up narrowing us in a way that I think is ultimately not helpful and not exactly reflective of what's happening in the biblical text.
Man, so then interesting. It's because it's like, yeah, like when you put it in context, he may not be God wasn't talking to people in 2022 about their careers. So then I guess, how do you merge being a Christian with figuring out your purpose? Like in your book, you touched on shalom and justice, and because I think for me, when asking the question purpose, like what happens sometimes, I'll get perspective from those who aren't Christian with wisdom that's sometimes is very applicable,
Yeah.
and then and I'll apply it, of course, and then sometimes you get perspective from Christians that sometimes may feel very lofty, like the Jeremiah verse where God got you, it's all gonna work out. And in merging the two, where does God come in? Yeah.
So this is where I want to go back to the nesting dolls.
Okay.
Okay. So if the call to belong is like, Jesus on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, just saying like, come on, to his disciples, like, follow me, right? This like real intimate, step-by-step physical thing that happens after Jesus. The next layer out is the call to create in loving service for our neighbors. The call to create goes all the way back to Genesis 1. God makes humankind in the image of God says like, let us make them male and female, and let's have them fill the earth with art and artifacts. Theologians would call this the creative mandate. And the reason why I love that, and yeah, I'm biased toward creativity, but it's like, as people of God, like we've got creative DNA. Like we absolutely have creative DNA. Some people will use the phrase co-creators. Now
Mm.
that shows up in a lot of different ways, co-creating with God. Okay, the next layer out is the call to participate in God's mission of redemption in the world. This is where you start getting justice and shalom. So this is 2 Corinthians 5. Like basically as Christians, we have we are ambassadors of the ministry of reconciliation. And this is like, the world is a troubling place. Like there is a lot of stuff that is not right here. Not people are not being treated well. And the story of God points toward the arc of restoration and hope, shalom, which is like the sense of wholeness that has peace in it and comes on the other side of justice and equity, not instead of it or without it. And so it's like, ooh, that's a big whole thing, right? But so then you start to get those layers nested within. And what that means, Joshua, is that no matter what context I'm in, that's my purpose, is to live out those things. It's actually both of our purpose. Like if we're believing people, and the way it's going to manifest is going to be really different based on that outermost nesting doll of particulars. It's going to show up differently in your life than it is in my life, but we actually share the call to belong, the call to create, the call to participate in redemption, and then our particulars are probably different,
Yeah.
right? And that's where the discernment and all of that comes in. But yeah, so that justice and shalom gets into that, like we are called as Christians, I believe, to participate in that.
And man, so it's like on one end, it's like you could try to like just soak in that like kumbaya of that, right?
Yeah,
Like,
right.
like okay, peace, shalom. But sometimes and especially today, it's easy to get caught up in like the hustle culture or just like being competitive or comparing yourself to others. And when you do that, sometimes it can put you in a place of like, all right, maybe I did participate a little bit in redemption and a little bit in bringing more, peace to those relationships around me. But when I look at what I've like accomplished,
Yeah.
it feels insignificant in comparison to seeing LeBron James dunk or seeing Jay-Z be a billionaire. And I guess like, how do you still find significance like when you may feel so small in comparison to like what you're seeing?
Well, I love what you're saying there, and I think it's important, and it's important for me. So I'm not called to be Jay-Z. I'm not called to have this widespread, multi-artistic and economic influence. That's different. Does it make and here's the question: does it make my impact on, let's say, 30 people that I'm close with any less significant? Like, I really don't think so in the eyes of God. Maybe maybe in our eyes, though, because the metrics and the rubrics of the world are different than the kingdom of God.
And I don't know if I've gotten there, to be honest, but I think I'm trying. But my take is, so like, if I were to get to a place where like I'm truly like where like I'm supposed to be, then when I'm influencing those 30 people, I'm so fulfilled from doing that I don't necessarily even care how I compare to Jay-Z. Is that the right perspective? Is that the right perspective? Is that the Christian perspective? Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to a scarcity and abundance mindset. So like, in a world of scarcity, we got to look out for ourselves. And there's this thing that happens where then we have to accumulate and we have to mark up, and like this, like I'm for sure this happens to me. So I'm not talking at you, I'm talking at myself here.
Yeah.
And again, like that's not a kingdom mindset. A kingdom mindset, like the economics of God would say, there is such an abundance here in the kingdom of God, so much so that God rested on Sunday and modeled that, created, and whether it's metaphorical or literal, people can take that up in a different conversation, but created the world in 6 days, and then rested on the seventh. And the Sabbath is for the community of God as one example of the fact that economics and scarcity and abundance play out. Our world says you got to work all the time. That ladder that you're chasing, those accomplishments that you got to get, that purpose that's got to be fulfilled by measuring yourself next to other people, that's never ending. And God says, actually, that's where you get to be subversive. Live as a Christian person that says, like, that's not where my worth's going to be found. Now that again, like that's a long arc kind of thing. Like I can say that to you, and then like tomorrow I can be like, dang, like I compared myself to this person. The other thing I want to say,
Mm.
and this comes from one of my college professors. I had to take Greek in college. Dude, I was not good at Greek. It just like was not good. I had to take 2 years of it. I'm like, I cried all the time. And he would say to me, Michaela, he's like, year one is root work and year two is fruit work. And I was like, I don't know what that means, Dr. Battle. Like, just like help me get through this Greek. And finally, what I realized he meant over time is that there are seasons for like sowing and planting, and like you don't see the fruit of that. So when you get back to 30 people, you might not always be fulfilled.
Mm.
I don't know if Jay-Z is fulfilled every day because some seasons are root work. And then other seasons are like the harvest, right? The fruit, you feel it. And I do think that we as people kind of ebb and flow in these rhythms, maybe even more than we always recognize. So the looking for personal satisfaction, I also don't know if it comes in every season. It depends on what is satisfying for us as individuals. Do I like root work? I still do not like it. I like to see fruit. I like harvest. I like bounty. I like sitting around the table. I like eating, drinking, and be merry. So that's the way I'm built. And so I just think that we have to allow for some of that, but know that if there's root work, there's fruit work coming, even if we aren't the ones that get to do the harvest.
Interesting. So is that basically saying that to have an expectation that you're always going to feel fulfilled is maybe not like just like not the right expectation?
I think it's going to let you down. I think it's I think work is good. I think work came in Genesis before the fall came, right? But like work is also this like thing. It's like blessed and cursed at the same time, right? And like it's been a means for exploiting people and human greed and like generative growth and truth. It's complicated. And so to think that we would always be fulfilled through this very complicated thing is probably unrealistic.
Yeah, no, and that makes sense to me because I mean, even in like everything that you want to do, there's always the grunt work of, or just something that comes along with it that you don't want to do.
Mm-hmm.
So that makes sense. So then, how do you remind yourself then that you're significant? So like, if I was born significant,
Yeah.
and this is like
Mm-hmm.
just like how I came out the womb, and then I find myself comparing myself to people who may make me feel like what I've done is small. How do I then remind myself that wait, no, I am significant. What I'm doing is significant. I'm not. How do you do that?
At the risk of sounding more kumbaya, I think it's actually like receiving love.
Mm.
And like I think about my mom. She don't care what I do. Like she does not care if I got a PhD or I started a business or I run the center. She just wants me to like come to the house and have dinner and like talk. And so like she loves me in the way that reminds me of that primary central stuff. And it doesn't put as much pressure. I'm not looking for as much to happen in the outer stuff. And so finding people that love you just because, I think that's part of how you stay grounded and not look for all those measures of success to be points of validation.
Man, and it's funny, yeah, because like when you were saying that, I was just thinking of how I feel like when I'm like at the house, just like with parents or loved ones. You almost don't even care anymore about like how you're perceived because you're accepted
And known.
So then it's almost like, is the significance that we're looking for really just like us looking for validation from people?
It's interesting because we've got this thing in us, this human thing. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
I want to do something. I want to make an impact. I'm wired for more.
It's
I
true,
care about
yeah.
people. And then we're like in the presence of our loved ones and we're like, gosh, it feels good to be loved. And I think that right there, like that is the human experience. It's the being loved, the striving for more, the dealing with disappointment, the circling back to other people. And so I think I'm like, both feel important to me.
And it's like if we didn't necessarily have that wrestle, would people even do the great things that they've done, or would it just ever be everybody just eating, sleeping, and being merry? And yeah, so wow, I didn't even think about it like that. Very interesting. So then, okay, something that you touched on that I actually wanted to better understand. So you talked about how the Trinity has like certain aspects about the Trinity can parallel themselves in this conversation of calling. Could you break that down?
Yeah. All right. Let's do a little Trinitarian theology. So the Trinity, the basic Christian idea that God is three in one and one in three. God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. And if we are made in the image of God, right? This is Genesis 1:26 through 28, where God says, let us make them in our image. First of all, who's us, right? We think us is the Trinity.
Yeah.
And so he's like, I get this little image just because it's helpful, like God looking to the left and right. And it's like, let's go on and make them in our image. Then we are made in the image of a relational God, and we are wired for relationships. So, and the other thing that's been progressively more true in this whole conversation on work and calling is that it's been very individualized. Like, what's my calling? What's my purpose? What am I to do? And it's like, well, how does that change when it's like, what's our purpose? What are we called to do? How are we sort of united to the people to the left and right of us? And so, like, the Trinity just becomes a helpful reminder that it's not all about us, it's not just about us, and we're not alone.
No, and when you touched on that in the book, it helped bring so much perspective to me, because sometimes you can almost feel like the fate of the world rests just on your shoulders. And even if you're someone who's Elon Musk, who's accomplished all these huge things, you never do things. You're never doing anything by yourself. And what you touched on in the book, which I definitely like agreed with a lot, was just like how the world didn't start with you and it doesn't end with you.
That's right.
You know what I mean? And at the end of the day, like, you could, it's like humbling, like you said, but at the same time, it's also like freeing.
Freeing.
In that, like, you know, like, it's gonna be okay. God is in control ultimately at the end of the day. So then, in the conversation of relationships, you talked about empathy, and you really stress the importance of like being empathetic. And how would you define empathy, and why is it important in the conversation of trying to figure out your purpose and your calling?
Yeah. So I did some research that was the basis for this book, and what I did was I did my research in a period where it was in the like 2010 2011. There was a huge like economic recession happening, and a bunch of people I knew were like without work, unemployment rates were super high, and it felt chaotic. And then there was this other group of people that I was observing that were sort of making their way through the world. I was like, wait a minute, how are these people achieving success? And these people are like shrouded in chaos. And so I did a research project that led to my dissertation, that led to this book, where I was asking Christian entrepreneurs the practices that had helped them achieve success. Now, they got to define success on their own terms, but what were the practices? I was surprised to find out that basically empathy was the thing that united everybody. It was the regular practice of empathy. And I say, how's empathy a practice? What is empathy?
Yeah.
Um, I let people talk. I let them go where they needed to go. Right. I wasn't like, here's the definition of practice. Like, you have to stay in this. And so it's, this capacity to, and there's a couple of scholars that do good work here, but it's this capacity to truly like feel what you're feeling, right?
Mm-hmm.
To cognitively sort of wrap your mind around it.
Yeah.
And then also to express concern. Like, I actually care. Let's like, I'm going to join you in this, right? That's empathy. And this is the start of the entrepreneurial way. I believe this is at the heart of what it means to be a Christian. I believe it's the thing that the world needs more of. I believe that, an increasingly polarized world, I'm like, oh, like, it's a skill to be able to like move toward each other. I draw this from the passage of the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan is a story. If you're familiar with the Christian faith at all, it might be one that you've heard. You got this lawyer who stands up to Jesus and is like, how do I go to heaven? And Jesus sort of gives him some, they go back and forth. And basically, Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan is like, do this and you'll be good. And the story of the Good Samaritan is there's a guy who's really hurt in a bad way on the side of a road. Two people pass by him that are like, center in society, like a politician and a religious person, like someone like me. I'm a religious person. I would have been the person who passed by probably. Then you get a Samaritan who lets empathy interrupt him, right? He's on his own route from some point A to point B, but he lets empathy interrupt him. He moves over in compassion. he ties his way forward, sharing of his own resources, and then like builds in kind of, partnership for the way forward. And that's back to that entrepreneurial thing. Like I can notice a need, help apply the resources I have at my disposal to add value to this. And so, and when people are trying to get going, like, what in the world should I do? Like, we've actually at the leadership center that I run, we've built a whole program around this. People are like, what should I do? What's my vocation? And we have them go through a process that starts with empathy to help take steps, because it's like the what should I do question gets really like loud in your own head. But when you start to observe and be able to move towards others, a lot of things about what you might do start to open up. So that's why I think empathy is important to the discernment piece.
And why that makes sense to me is when I think about life and I think about business and I think about just like career and entrepreneurship, it comes down to me, it's like all businesses, solve problems to a certain degree. And with solving problems, you're really putting yourself in the shoes of a group of people or someone else, and basically trying to solve pain points that group is feeling.
Right.
So like I definitely see what you're saying with like why being empathetic is important, and how you could also get a sense of fulfillment from it and find your particulars that make you unique. Because somebody may look at like this room and different things would stand out to different people. Somebody may look at my outfit and say, hey, I would have done it like this instead of like that. Somebody may say, hey, I would paint the walls this way. And I think that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I guess like the problems that bother you the most might be sometimes the problems that you're here to solve. Yeah. And that's like you being a significant person, having an opportunity to be a gift to the world.
The professor is in right there.
Oh man, I'm just a student. I'm just a student of the book. I'm just a student of the book. So then, wow. So then, all right. So then I think.
So if I could just say one last thing, it's for people that are trying to make their way, like be encouraged just in that. One thing that I talk about in the book is like next doable risk, right? It's like we don't figure that there's only 24 hours in a day. Only spend so many of those working. There's only so much we can do. And this is not my phrase, but it's kind of like we overestimate what we can do in a day or in a year, but we underestimate what we can do over the long haul. And so just like that step by step, day by day, on the way approach is one that just be encouraged in that.
I love it. And last question. So like for those who are like super planners, like super life planners, right? Yeah. Who like hear you and they're like, oh no. Like, I need to know my 5-year plan, my 10-year plan, and my 15-year long-term plan. How that seems to contradict the entrepreneurial way to a certain degree, right?
Yeah.
What would you say to that person?
I would say do your plans because that's what you need, but learn how to notice when your plans need to be adapted, and learn how to notice like create feedback loops into those plans, so that I'm not saying throw your plans out the window. Like I know plenty of people who are wired this way, but the chances that you're going to do exactly what you think you're going to do in 15 years in exactly the way, you just don't have all the pieces yet. Like that's a long time. You're going to learn a lot more about yourself. The world's going to be pretty different in 15 years. So learn how to know when you need to adapt, but still make your plans. That's what you need.
Agreed. Wow. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And the biggest thing I think I took from this is that you're significant already. And if you're searching for significance, it's you're searching for something that you already have. And I think that piece that genuinely brought me peace, and like just kind of helped calm down. Like when you're ambitious and you're trying to do 1,000 different things, you can hang your everything on just like the next win. And I think that for me, just reminding myself, you know what, you're significant, and now you have an opportunity to give to the world has allowed for me to give, I think, more creatively and from just a better place.
Well, that's the thing though. Like, and the last thing here is because it actually frees up your work. So when the significance is found centrally in the idea that you belong to God, like you matter, what you bring back to work is actually also better.
Yeah.
And so it works both ways. So they're very connected. So well said.
Thank you. God bless you. Let's get it. We're done.
Oh, this was great.